sea level rise. Also, it could be, increasing temperatures on land and in the sea. So what happens when temperatures increase in the Caribbean Sea? For example, we could have massive coral reef die off, which is what we've been seeing over the last, it's been happening over the last few years in different regions. Ocean acidification and salinization as well. Also, glacial retreat is a slow onset event. And then also loss and damage could also be economic and non-economic loss and damage. And economic losses, it's much more easier to quantify and to like assign a monetary value to, because these are anything that could be, traded in markets. So any sort of goods and services. So economic losses could be, loss of income due to, loss of business operations, loss of agricultural produce, and so on. Or it could be loss and damage to physical assets if it's infrastructure or property. And then non-economic losses, these are more intangible and much more difficult to quantify and measure. Because these are things that, you don't, they're not commonly traded in markets, basically. So non-economic losses could be, loss of life, impacts on health, if it's related to, infectious diseases, NCDs, or also, psychological trauma due to any sort of extreme event like a hurricane. Also, any sort of impacts related to climate displacement and human mobility. Loss and damage in terms of the non-economic losses could also relate to loss of territory, which is quite important for SIDS. What happens when the sea level rises and where are we going to go? Also loss of indigenous knowledge and cultural heritage and so on, and also related to loss of biodiversity and ecosystem services. So you see, loss and damage is very, complex and multi-layered. And when we're starting to talk about the impacts and effects, it's not only things that we could easily assign a value to. It's things that are long lasting and much more difficult to measure, but they're so very important, like the loss of culture, the loss of indigenous knowledge, impacts on health, which is what we're seeing right now. I mean, thinking about right now, it's quite hot. It's very hot. So how does that impact on outdoor workers, or, looking at productivity in the workplace, or even in the classroom, for example? How can people basically survive in this heat and still be productive? How does it impact on our way of life and so on as well? So just a bit of a overview on loss and damage and the concepts that, we discuss and talk about. And in terms of the history of loss and damage in the UNFCCC, just to know, this is a term that's been around for decades, since 1991, before the UNFCCC was even agreed and entered into force. And it was only up until when was it? When it was only up until like COP19, which is in 2030, where the Warsaw International Mechanism and its EXCOM was established. And this is really a specialized body under the UNFCCC that provides technical advice and research and policy and so on into loss and damage. And then at COP21 in 2015, where the Paris Agreement was adopted, this is where, Article 8, which is a standalone article on loss and damage, was actually included, which really legitimized and formalized the importance of loss and damage in the UNFCCC and in the international climate change negotiations. And moving forward, it took some years again, and it wasn't until COP27 in 2022 when we finally got the historic loss and damage fund and funding arrangements were established. And it took, again, some time before the loss and damage fund was fully operationalized. This happened at COP29 last year. in Baku, Azerbaijan. And the new fund, like the official name of the fund is actually called the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage. And this is I would say, a big win for small island states like the Caribbean, because we have a fund that is supposed to support how we recover and rebuild, and also how we minimize loss and damage affecting us due to climate change. And in terms of why this loss and damage fund is important and it's different from the other, I would say, mechanisms, is because we need a fund that's responsive and flexible. So we need timely support. If a hurricane hits, we cannot be waiting 2 years for and trying to apply for, and developing a proposal, waiting for feedback and so on. The impact's happening now, and we have to deal with how do we rebuild and how do we recover and help our communities and countries. Also, the fund for loss and damage, it's country owned and led, so it has to support be context sensitive and context defined. So it has to be, these are the issues and the priorities of the country or the region, and really supporting direct access in terms of communities are able to access this funding. Also looking at programmatic approaches. So, looking at more long-term support for loss and damage, consistent and sustainable financial support rather than just project by project basis. Because as you know, loss and damage doesn't happen on a project basis. It continues. Climate change impacts happens long-term, regardless of whether the project finishes. We still have to continue this sort of work. So it's looking at this long-term view of what is sustainable finance for climate action. And this is something that I think for climate philanthropy and for the Caribbean is something we should start thinking about really critically. Move away from these pilot projects and project approach to something that's more long-term. So we have a more programmatic type approach in climate finance. And these are just, some of the meeting outcomes for the board, and I won't go into too much detail, but just to note that at the 5th board meeting, which happened in Barbados in April this year, the early startup phase of the fund was actually established. And I love the name. It's called the BIM, the Barbados Implementation Modalities. And it's really the startup phase is really to start testing out what sort of funding modalities and resource allocations and what areas do we prioritize under the fund for responding to loss and damage. There was a 6th board meeting that happened in July, but I think they were still stalled on moving forward a lot of the decisions relating to governance and so on. But the BIM has, it's moving forward with implementation, and I did know that that's something that we definitely should consider for climate philanthropy and how we could support loss and damage financing through philanthropy in the region. And just in terms of the funding modalities, these are the different types, small grants, risk sharing, insurance mechanisms, programmatic approaches, and so on. And the 3 modalities in teal, they're the ones that are prioritized for the Barbados implementation modalities, that startup phase. So looking at long-term programmatic approaches, readiness support. So, how to get systems, policies, institutions ready for accessing and responding to loss and damage in the country. And then also looking at rapid displacement via direct budget support, direct to countries. So all of that, just to give an overview of loss and damage from a UNFCCC high-level understanding to something that's more on looking at climate justice and loss and damage from a Caribbean context. So in terms of understanding loss and damage, loss and damage really is it really it's really trying to understand loss and damage and climate justice in the context of what's happening. And it's useful to know that for decades, climate change has been framed mainly as a, purely environmental or physical problem that has relatively straightforward causes and effects. So humans emit greenhouse gases, and these gases cause global warming and environmental change. And a changed environment then affects people, right? So with that being said, most of the focus has been paid to technical solutions. So how can we reduce greenhouse gases? Or, what are the basic levels of adaptation that could reduce risks? But, you know, what we know is that climate change affects much more than just reducing greenhouse gases and looking at basic levels of adaptation. It affects people, it affects health, it affects communities, social structures, ecosystem services, and so on as well. And now climate justice, it really turns this logic of thinking of climate change as like a physical or environmental problem and focusing on technical solutions mainly. It really turns that on its head. And it exposes the fact that the causes and effects of climate change are much more complex and requires more nuanced and inclusive approaches. So climate justice really addresses, the just division, fair sharing, and equitable distribution of the benefits and burdens of climate change and the responsibilities to deal with climate change. And climate justice highlights that the causes and impacts of climate change are neither distributed nor experienced equally, and that, there are structural, systemic, and historical factors that have led to these inequalities, right? And we see that happening right here in the Caribbean. And, in terms of climate justice and how and how we view climate justice in the Caribbean, it's really important to know that climate justice is a critical lens to understand inequalities and how they influence the way in which climate change is experienced. And just to know that SIDS are responsible for less than 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions, but we're the most vulnerable to the impacts, despite being the least responsible. So they always say that, SIDS are on the front lines of the climate emergency or climate disaster. And really and truly, climate change and climate justice, sorry, is how Caribbean countries have framed and engaged with the international climate change negotiations. So we really use a climate justice framing in when we go to these negotiations and push and advocate for climate finance and support and so on to address these issues. And climate change is an existential threat to the Caribbean. And we all know, and I'm sure over the years we've seen these these pictures. This is the 1.5 to Stay Alive campaign that was actually led by Caribbean NGOs right here, and it's now a global campaign of the importance of 1.5 degrees Celsius um, as the global temperature limit that actually is included in the Paris Agreement. And recently, the highest international court, the International Court of Justice, in July this year, actually delivered their advisory opinion stating that the 1.5 degrees Celsius is the legal temperature limit of the Paris Agreement. It's indisputable, and all countries have to adhere to this, which is a major win for small islands and for the Caribbean, because we've been calling for the fact that we need to look at 1.5 degrees Celsius. We can't look any further because the thing is, even at 1.5 or at 1.1 degrees Celsius above, pre-industrial limits, temperature limits, we're still going to get, and we are experiencing loss and damage impacts at 1.5 is probably the minimum, or sorry, the maximum we could sustain to have life as we know it. And beyond that is that like will SID still survive? So that's how 1.5 degrees Celsius has been framed and advocated by SIDS, including the Caribbean. It's really for our survival. And it's important that climate justice is incorporated there. And in terms of, now linking loss and damage and climate justice, and you see, when you look at loss and damage and climate justice, you really talk about finance, and that's a real key climate justice issue that SIDS in the Caribbean and elsewhere have advocated for in the international climate change negotiations. So I give a little bit of info about the Fund for Responding to Loss and Damage that was established in 2022 at COP27, and it's now been operationalized and capitalized and fully operationalized, I must say. And it still has approximately 700 million US, which sounds like a lot of money, but really and truly, when you have to divide it across so many different countries with different impacts and different types of loss and damage events and so on, is that really enough? So something to note. And I really want to now talk about really trying to understand the historical and structural and systemic inequalities that shape why our region is so vulnerable to climate change. And I really appreciate this quote from a paper by Dr. Leon Seeley Huggins. And it's the reliance of many Caribbean economies on sectors that are threatened by climate change, notably tourism, agriculture, and fishing, is not merely a feature of geography, but a condition with historical antecedents, precipitated by countries' insertion into a vastly unequal global system of relations post-independence. And this is a lot to unpack, but it really explains and highlights why the Caribbean is so incredibly vulnerable to climate change. And it's not because of, and really and truly, it's not really any fault of ours. Our main economic sectors are very climate sensitive. In the 1960s to 1980s, most of us gained independence, and we're now part of this global system as independent states. But now we have to deal with climate change and all these other external shocks on top of trying to deal with how do we traverse this sort of global system where you have actors that have been independent for much longer. So you realize there's a lot of other deep-seated issues here that really affect how we are impacted more severely to climate change, because we're not able to adapt or respond or recover as effectively. And just in terms of trying to unpack this historical underpinnings of climate vulnerability in the Caribbean, just to note that, in the region, we have high levels of fiscal debt. We have amongst one of the highest in the world. And we're one of the most indebted regions in the world. We also have a very high reliance on imported goods. We suffer from food insecurity. And we saw that especially during COVID. Also, the fact that 60% of our populations and major assets and critical infrastructure are located along the coastlines. As I said, also our dependence on climate vulnerable sectors, and all these characteristics really are systemic and are caused by centuries of exploitation. So we have to look at how did our colonial and imperialist histories really create this situation which could exacerbate our vulnerability to climate change, right? And it's looking at that view, because this now is looking at intersectionality. It's not only climate change and looking at technical solutions, but also looking at how do we incorporate, dealing with gender issues, looking at race, looking at social and economic inequalities and so on. That could also, at the same time, when we're dealing with that, deal also with reducing our vulnerability to climate change, but then also in supporting sustainable development and economic development priorities as well. So it's a lot to unpack, but it's just for you really to start understanding this discussion and this issue and see where you fit in. Because climate change isn't only for the technocrats or the advocates and so on, it's really for everybody. And then what's important to note is the importance of climate justice as a framework for climate action in the region. And I think we all have experienced and seen this, but climate injustices exist at all levels. And those who are least able to respond to climate change are often the most affected. And, you know, we've seen that with people who, you know, let's say there's this example of after Hurricane Beryl had hit Barbados and the fishing industry was incredibly impacted. So governments were giving grants and so on to help with, you know, recovering losses and so on to their fishing equipment and so on. But the issue was that a lot of the fishermen and the fisher folk, they actually didn't have bank accounts or they didn't have TINs, tax. Oh, I can't remember what they call it, tax identification numbers. So because that was an eligibility requirement to access these grants, a lot of people were not able to get that. So they basically had to figure out, they were on their own, basically. And only people who, you know, they're a bit more well off and they have these things, they have a bank account, they have like a TIN because they have to pay income tax and so on, they were able to access this. So what's important is that as a region that's facing climate injustice globally, we should not continue to perpetuate these injustices within our countries. So you see, even though we have grants and we have programs and so on to support people dealing with you know, with flooding and hurricanes and so on, are they really reaching the ones who are most vulnerable, or are we actually creating impediments because it's not designed to really be properly just and equitable? And so it's something to think about. And really and truly, any sort of actions for climate change should not worsen existing inequalities and should really strive to recognize and address these injustices so we don't perpetuate the cycle of inequality and worsen climate vulnerability and so on. Because climate change isn't going to go away and these impacts will be affecting people over and over. So it's how do we build resilience in the face of climate change? And so I just wanted to share just a few reports, but I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. This was a report, a review of loss and damage in the Caribbean, 1994 to 2004, that my team and I had developed, and it was released in 2024. So I put the link, and it was really a systematic overview of loss and damage and how loss and damage was, you know, defined, how it was measured, and how Caribbean countries really estimated loss and damage costs, and what were the loss and damage finance needs as well. So I think it's quite useful, and definitely encourage you to read it. And then also, my team and I, we're also doing a technical paper on loss and damage financing and debt sustainability in the Caribbean. And it's a study between UE Silices and CA Caribbean. And it's really, and as I noted, you know, we have, the Caribbean countries have very high fiscal debt, and loss and damage and climate change could really impact on debt. So it's really trying to unpack that. And looking at how loss and damage financing could encourage debt sustainability and reducing debt in the region. So what I think is quite important is a key element of this paper, and it'll be released in time for COP, so in November this year. but also we'll be having like consultations and so on about it I think will be in October. We'll have a regional dialogue on loss and damage in October, where we'll be presenting the findings and be requesting feedback and inputs and insights from stakeholders. So definitely I'll share the more information about that, the loss and damage dialogue, and also the paper with the CLASP team. So really and truly a big part of this research is to look at what the equity and justice dimension of loss and damage should entail to ensure that, you know, the most vulnerable communities and sectors are prioritized. And I think that's quite important to look at loss and damage finance from this justice and equity lens. And this is just a list of innovative financing mechanisms that, you know, are used or discussed to address loss and damage in the Caribbean. And when you look at this, these are really high level sort of instruments that people, can communities, can NGOs and so on really engage on the design, on the implementation and so on. How can they start doing that? So that's really what we wanted to start looking at, how to increase the sort of participation and how to make these instruments more inclusive and relevant to the context of Caribbean communities and vulnerable groups and so on. So in terms of some preliminary policy recommendations, and I think it kind of fits with the Caribbean Climate Funder commitments. You know, we always talk about the importance of data collection, of research and so on. And really and truly, that is a priority for the region. And it's to ensure that we have resources and sustainable funding to ensure that we capture the data and research and so on. Also, how do we enhance access to climate finance in the region? And also ensuring that any of the financing instruments for loss and damage and so on, and the projects as well, also doesn't create any new debt and seeks to reduce existing debt. And the importance of fostering regional cooperation, if it's for knowledge sharing, capacity building, and coordinated action. And just looking at that sort of overview of loss and damage, of, you know, climate justice, and looking at loss and damage finance and debt sustainability, I think it's quite useful to look now at what are the entry points for climate philosophy, climate philanthropy in loss and damage finance. And you know, these will be discussed a lot more at the forum in October, but it's just something for people to start thinking about. And I outlined some of the low-hanging fruits that, you know, climate philanthropy in the Caribbean should really focus on within the next, I would say, I don't know, 1 to 3 years or something. And the first one is, how could we support existing UNFCCC loss and damage mechanisms? So, as I said, we have the Barbados implementation modalities, which is the early startup phase of the fund for responding to loss and damage. So they'll be having calls for proposals or applications and so on happening soon. And it'll be useful to see how can philanthropic capital, what sort of injections of philanthropic capital could go into existing project activities and so on to really augment the impact on the ground. If it is related to, I don't know, mangrove restoration, or if it's related to direct cash transfers and so on to vulnerable communities. Also and I didn't mention this, but the Santiago network is specialized, I would say, body under the Warsaw International Mechanism, and it really is the technical arm of loss and damage in the UNFCCC. And the Santiago network was operationalized and so on as well over the last few years, and it's supposed to be providing technical assistance and guidance to the fund, right? So one of the things that the Santiago Network is doing right now is they have these calls for technical assistance by countries. And it's really for countries to help understand and develop loss and damage national strategies or policies, institutions, and so on. To really get to really improve their policy and institutional capacity, and also prepare them for being able to access loss and damage financing and so on. So it will be looking at how can we inject philanthropic capital into like Santiago Network technical assistance projects in the Caribbean, for example. So far, only Vanuatu in the Pacific has actually applied and actually they started their technical assistance from the Santiago Network. So it's quite new still as well. Then also looking at parametric insurance. So we have the CRIF here in the region, and they offer a whole host of parametric insurance from the country level to, you know, sectoral level to also, I would say, individual. So one of the things we could look at is top-ups, so parametric products at the country level. So maybe top-ups for, I don't know, flood policies and excess rainfall policies. So that would help with countries actually getting increased payouts if there's any sort of flood events and so on. And then also looking at it at the micro level. So the CRIF has these micro insurance products called POOS, which is for fishermen, and they also have various livelihood protection policies related to farming. And it's how could, you know, climate philanthropy support these sorts of microinsurance products, so to encourage and enable you know, the most vulnerable sectors to have some sort of financial livelihood security in the event of any sort of loss and damage event, right? So that's something to look at. Then also, there's also, of course, research, data collection, and capacity building. So I'll always include that. Um, and then in terms of anticipatory financing, so this is something that's been well developed and utilized in Africa, but not really here in the Caribbean. And is basically, if you know, it's this mechanism where if there's a specified trigger, let's say a particular level of of like, you know, if there's a certain level of rainfall or
Right.
the water level has been at a certain level. I'm almost finished, so
Mhm.
just give me like 2 minutes.
No, no, no. I'm. This part is very relevant, and then we'll go
Okay,
to the questions in the chat.
sure, no problem.
Mhm.
So this whole thing about anticipatory finance is to be able to give out a payment
Yeah.
before an event to help the most vulnerable communities, fishermen, farmers, and at-risk communities prepare. So
Right.
say if the, you know, there's a predefined trigger, like a particular, you know, river level has been breached,
Yeah. The
then the
riverine
payment
alerts and all those things.
yeah,
Right.
the payment goes out to specified communities and so on, but they're support and they should use it for, you know, preparing for, let's say, a flood. So let's say
Mhm.
they're able to, I don't know,
The sandbags.
secure
Yeah.
their property and so on before,
Hmm.
so the level of damage will be less because they've been able
Right.
to prepare, right? Because so it's actually very proactive, and I think it's
Hmm.
something that climate philanthropy should consider, because how do we do that here? And it'll be a lot more meaningful because you're empowering people to be able to prepare and
Yeah.
deal
Before
with
disaster.
yeah, before a disaster. So I think that's where the justice and equity aspect comes in.
Hmm.
Then also, I know I discussed and I gave that example about the fisher folk in Barbados after Hurricane Beryl. So how do we increase access to climate finance that is just and equitable to the most
Hmm.
vulnerable? So looking
Right.
at prioritizing local or regional intermediaries like NGOs to or civil society groups or faith-based organizations who have that sort of trust to really within the communities and so on to disburse grants. Um,
Right.
right? So you don't have to go through these onerous processes of like trying to make sure that you meet with the funder commitments and so on, but it goes there and it's needs based. Then also looking at how can we support indigenous banking and saving models. So, we have like Susu and Boxan, also the importance of
Mm-hmm.
cooperatives. And this is really ensuring that, the unbanked, the informal sector,
Mm-hmm.
workers and rural communities are able now to access finance for themselves. It's not a handout or anything like that, but they're able now. It's how do you preserve dignity, really,
Yeah.
and truly. Um, and how
Where
can
it's not
you do
like
that?
somebody's begging.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's trust based, and it's something that in the Caribbean, it's something that communities do all the time, families
Yeah.
do.
Mm.
And then also, how do we implement simplified access and eligibility criteria? So, you know, don't create these systems or these products that are inaccessible or to the people who need them the most. So if it is that we need to that one of the requirements is that in order to get the grant, you need to have a bank account, help people get bank accounts, right?
Mm-hmm.
Bring the bank to or the
To the
bank office
community.
to the
Yeah.
community if it is that is a requirement.
Yeah.
And
Or the
so these
credit
are
union.
things to or the credit union
Mm-hmm.
exactly. So these are
Mm-hmm.
things to think about, low hanging fruits and so on, which we'll discuss more definitely in the
At
forum
the forum.
and after.
Mm.
Um, any questions? And this is
I'm
my
gonna go through the chat for you now,
introduction.
Sash, because people were
Oh,
putting.
sure.
So Narissa from
I'll just stop
Narissa,
sharing.
remind me the organization you with the Center for Policy Development for the Caribbean.
Yes,
Uh,
yeah, Caribbean Center, Caribbean
Go
Policy
ahead.
Development Center.
Mhm. Mhm.
Hey.
She wanted you to rename the name of the organization in Barbados that's been supporting the fund. I
Fun.
think it was
Yeah.
early on in your presentation. She came in.
So it's not an organization. So the Barbados implementation modality, the BIM,
Mm-hmm.
that's the early startup phase of the fund for responding to loss and damage. So it's like their
Okay.
pilot project within there. It's called the BIM. If you go online and so on the FRLD's web page and so on, you will see more information on it.
Okay. No
So
problem.
it's the
And
state of Barbados, actually. It's the government.
no,
Yeah.
no, no, no,
No.
no, no, it's not. So
Okay.
because the board meeting of the Loss and Damage Fund was held in Barbados, and
Mm-hmm.
Ah.
they agreed on the startup phase, the early startup phase was established in Barbados. That's why
Mm-hmm.
it's called the BIM.
Okay. It's
So
like
that's what,
Escazú. It's
yeah,
like how
yeah,
Escazú got
exactly,
named
exactly.
Escazú.
But I just
Right.
love that they call it BIM. So
Yeah.
that's what you'll be seeing all the time.
But that fund is
Okay.
not. It's for the Caribbean. It's just a
No,
model.
no, 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 no. This
Mhm.
is the fund for responding to loss and damage is a global fund that was
Right.
established under the UNFCCC. And the early
Right.
startup phase of the
Mhm.
fund, which is called the
Mhm.
BIM, is like that's the pilot to test out.
Okay.
So it's for every country as
Everybody.
well. Yeah,
Okay.
every developing
Wow.
country. It's just called the BIM because the board
Okay.
meeting was in Barbados.
All right. Okay.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
the
for the it's
confusion.
it's the testing model for loss and damage for the global
For loss and
community
damage financing and
financing.
how the different modalities and financing instruments and so on will look like.
Yeah, and they're using the so what I think what I'm trying to grasp is okay, the the meeting was in Barbados. They're test and they're structuring it. They're structuring it, and they're going to be um I guess testing it is the word I'm trying to come up with.
Well,
Is it
yeah,
that
so
they
that's why it's called the early startup phase to see how it will look, right?
okay?
So they have, so that's how they will do it. And I'll share more info about the fund and like the links to the website
Mhm.
for the fund and and which will have more information about the Barbados implementation modalities that the startup.
Barbados. I'm gonna write it in the chat.
Because basically this is where the first set of disbursements from the loss and damage fund will happen through there. So I think it's something that, you know, Carifil and any sort of philanthropy should look at.
Right.
So how to
And get
maximize?
involved with, right? And start to get
Yeah,
involved with. Okay,
exactly,
great.
exactly.
The Barbados I spelled implementation wrong, guys.
Mm-hmm.
Implementation modality. So y'all could feel free to Google it. And Thea's comments, just forgive her mic just shut down right before the meeting. At least we got 2 meetings done early this morning. She is can you answer the question above? What role could philanthropy play? All right, so I think maybe this question you covered in your last slide. She was
So
asking,
I'll just bring up this slide again.
yeah,
Just
what role specifically can philanthropy play in showing climate finance, ensuring that climate finance includes loss and damage
right.
and accessibility through the community level, which I think she put this up right before you put your last slide
Mm-hmm.
up. But I
Okay.
think from what it is you discussed, and we had some real practical examples. I specifically love the example of anticipatory financing, because we
Mhm.
all live in a time where we've been getting these hurricane alerts and riverine level alerts. And people, whilst we see like the ODPM in Trinidad becoming a little more active in terms of giving out the information before we have extreme weather event, there's not really information about where can you go and get some sort of support um, to help you prepare. The most I would see what was happening, I think the last severe one, but it was very community specific. Um, and I didn't hear about all communities having this access, but going to your community center and getting some
Mhm.
sandbags and things like that. But from what I just understood from talking to the people, it wasn't like all communities had that
Yeah.
access. So you see the inequity happening there based on our, how how governments are structured in countries, and us having regional corporations, and some of the regional corporations having some action and the rest and others
Mhm.
not.
Yeah.
So
So
yeah.
how can climate philanthropy really help to augment
Mhm.
um these sorts of proactive sort of responses to dealing with loss and damage, and really helping communities and individuals to lead on this, and not actually
Right.
get incur more debt, or it's harder for them to rebuild and so on, because it's a lot easier if you're able to prepare
Right.
rather than having to rebuild from everything, like everything all over again. um and having no access, so it's difficult. They don't know what to do, what sort of, like, who they should go to, what sort of support is available and so on. So it's really thinking about, if you want to look at justice and equity, um and I know that's one of the goals. What is it? Allocating resources boldly and equitably. What does that mean in the context of justice and equity in the region, right?
Right. So
um
what we'll use is, we do have a revised a vision, a draft for already. But what I will specifically support at coming out of this meeting are the comments that Indira gave, just to review the draft again, make sure we have very specifically that it is to reduce inequities, especially when it comes to those that sometimes are left behind, the disabled, and also to support very specific um, philanthropic support for these types of funds that are happening.
yeah.
Narissa, you
so
could
so
go ahead and
yeah.
raise your hand and ask your question, or you don't have to raise your hand. You could go ahead and open your mic and ask the question.
Yes, I was just asking for follow-up questions with respect to if there are any major announcements in terms of
Mhm.
operationalizing the FRLD, the BIM protocol, as well
Mhm.
as how open they are in terms of engaging our sector, the CSO, the NGO organizations like CLASP and
Mhm.
Climate Philanthropy.
Yeah. So I mean, the expectation is for them to actually announce the first, at least the first call for
Mm-hmm.
applications to the BIM at COP30. And
Mhm.
then in terms of engaging the NGO CSO sector, you know, we like CSOs and so on are definitely observers. It's actually open to be an observer to the board meetings. There's also the loss and damage collaboration where they compile and provide comments and feedback and so on from civil society and communities from around the world. So I'll just write that in.
Yeah.
So and they definitely follow all the the board meetings and so on of the loss and damage fund and also the Santiago network. So I would definitely encourage you guys to follow up with them and provide your views. Like there are mechanisms, and then also the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance. I'm the one of the co-lead for the Access to Finance Working Group, and we actually did develop and compile a submission from, you know, civil society organizations and so on from the region to the call by the loss and damage collaboration in advance of that board meeting that was held in Barbados in April this year. So I mean, these things are happening. It just came up very quickly, so we couldn't do any sort of major, you know, call for
advocacy
submission.
and stuff.
Yeah, but we did.
But the good thing is, you know, the Justice Alliance worked well, like for what it was formed for.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So these are, and then also if anybody's interested in joining the Caribbean Climate Justice Alliance, it's open. I'll share the link as well for these things.
Yes,
so I'm just typing these things down so I won't forget.
Yeah.
Right.
And it's
I'll share
recorded.
the links
Recorded.
after. So but I know everybody's interested in this loss and damage fund, but just know that it's just around 700 million, which is not a lot of money.
yes.
So
I know.
and one of the the expectations and especially from SIDS and LDCs is that they would have like a special window for access by civil society and communities, like a special community access window for the fund, but that's not part of the BIM yet. So similar to, I guess, the Jeff Small Grants program. Yeah. So they definitely wanted to make it more responsive and inclusive. And I think this is something that you know, this is something that Carifil could share best practices and so on with.
Yeah.
So it's things to take note. That's why, you know, research and so on is so important, that we need to have funding for that.
Right. And I know the last question I noted in the chat, which I think you did answer, Natalie, was asking about the link to report. So Natalie, what will happen is we have a kind of collaboration going on Caribbean Climate Analytics, and anything that Sasha shares with us, especially upcoming events, where you mentioned you were going to talk more about the report and discuss the findings from the report at your loss and damage and convenings. We will share with the members of the committee that's been helping us with the commitment. So if there is any other pressing questions, I would like to very much thank Sasha so much for being part of the meeting today. It was extremely not just interesting, but, you know, I would say complementary to what we're doing under the funders' commitment, and recognizing that all the different mechanisms that we've been discussing for the Caribbean region, we need to find a way to work together on it and find strategies to implement it, because it doesn't make sense these things sit on desks and in boardrooms and the funding itself is not being aligned to what the strategies are. And I think having more and more funders recognizing this through the commitment and through other strategies, through our forum and convening, it will be important to streamline how we set the pace for the next couple of years. Go ahead, Indira. Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry for coming in at this point.
No, go ahead.
So big thanks, just to echo. It's a pleasure to hear the summary and simply to be excited about following the links and so, but a quick, not for a response, a quick point that came to mind was that would there be like an allocation? As you said, there was a special window being thought through for the community and NGOs and so for the area of anticipatory financing, which Talia mentioned. And I asked that, as I said, it's not for a response, and I'll tell you why I asked that. It is always more compelling when there's a disaster happening to direct funding to it and for encouraging money to move in that direction. But as we all know, prevention is also important. And in your first opening bat with that picture that you liked, it talks about things that were slowly encroaching as one. And the slowly encroaching thing is where I think philanthropy can enter as well as just a point, simply because when you go after grants and so, which is a space I play in, they want to see direct impact. They have a range of requests, and they have to probably, in my understanding of how things work, look at the most compelling and respond to it. But for the slow moving sort of encroachment and disaster actions and climate damages, loss and damage, and etc., and climate effects, I think philanthropy can enter in that space for the long-term sort of responses. And I like that Carifil Alliance is also looking at the media and the storytelling part and the advocacy as being important, simply because, and I'll leave with this small point, I am a 60-year-old who hangs clothes in a line, right? And, long ago, we all did that, but now everybody, you look at it and you say it doesn't look good for the facade of the building and so. But I also bring that as a small sort of anecdotal entree into the discussion to say small interventions at the level of the individual will add up. And so you might frown upon something that is small, but certainly stories that tell about small interventions that connect with the bigger issue, I think will go a long way. So I think my daughter, who's of course about 20 something, she's saying, you don't look for the big leaps. They're not looking for the big leaps. They're looking for small changes which add up. And small changes add up even exponentially when you have many persons contributing to those small changes. So thank you a lot, both to Carifil Alliance and Sasha. Thank you.
Okay, so we're going to wrap up very, very quickly by just sharing a little information with you guys. Jamila, I'm going to share my screen, and I guess you could just leave me on spotlight with the. So I hope, based on Sasha's presentation, and whilst I didn't get very specifically into the commitment, I'm going to be sharing the commitment with a little more updates based from today as a Google document. And I really want you guys to just add your comments as best as you could. You could take your time. Our next meeting, not to take your time and forget, our next meeting will be sometime mid-September. Middle to the beginning of mid-September. We haven't set the date yet. I'm trying to work with some of the other committee members who are I'm now getting messages from Malini how she's she's at the university as well too as Indira, but she's been busy with campus starting. So I want to make sure we set the date in September where we would allow a little more people to attend and critically get into a discussion on the actual funders agreement. One of the most important things that I would just like to share from today, or to just close off the meeting from today, is what's happening. Sasha mentioned it, Indira knows about it, a couple of the guests may not know about it, but what's happening in, when we keep saying the forum. So we have a forum coming up in October. Oops. It's called Future Forward. I'd really like to encourage those who could attend online. We do have an online option and in person to seek out more information on it. To seek out more information and determine very quickly if you all could attend. I'm sharing information today, and most of you all, if any of you all have not been receiving any emails from us, just identify in the chat that you have never got an email on the Future Forward event, and I'll make sure to add you all to our database to improve how you all are getting the communication. But basically, the purpose of this event is to shape the future of philanthropy in the Caribbean region and raise the visibility of the Caribbean Philanthropic Alliance and the work that we're doing. It's a groundbreaking Caribbean philanthropy event designed to build philanthropy infrastructure and guide equitable and sustainable funding and investment. So we will have a dynamic program of other speakers. The agenda and everything is online. I will share some links in the chat shortly. And it's a showcase very much growing multi-sector partnerships that we have all been witnessing in the region, especially those who are doing co-financing, and to spotlight philanthropy contributions in the Caribbean. And we want to also make sure at the forum we could discuss any projects that people who have been doing Caribbean-wide projects that need investment. We want to elevate and podiate some of those projects and to see if we could get some more funding injected into it, especially when it comes to the to climate crisis and, of course, the intersectional issues with women. And we are going to have a recognition event, why is my slides not going? A recognition event at the forum. It's called the Caribbean Women Impact Awards. It's the first time we're hosting those awards. We're hoping for it to be annual. And of course, we are going to include men and have a youth focus as well too within the near future, where we have awards for all of our wonderful men and young people that have been striving and promoting and doing so much good work and innovative projects in climate change. So the core objectives is to strengthen regional and philanthropic ecosystem, promote regional collaboration, innovations and projects, and of course advocate for policy change. And there is going to be a very special focus at Future Forward on climate philanthropy based on our CLASP project that's happening. So CLASP is going to be a highlight at the event, but it's also to discuss all the other philanthropic needs we have in the region, especially as you guys know, there are severe inequity in the region when it comes to those facing poverty. We have our sister or brother country, I think I'll call a sister country of Haiti, that has so much grievous social problems that need support. So these are the target audiences. I really want to support the call for collaboration for our event. Please share the event as best as you can, especially with anybody that does philanthropy in your country and that you may be aware of. Academic institutions, the media. We need more media presence at the event, and by that I mean we have the media in Jamaica mobilized, but it would be great to have a Caribbean media presence there. And of course, entrepreneurs, business sector is very important, the private sector, governments, and of course, those doing corporate social responsibility type of funding and financing. Right. This is a special spotlight, philanthropy and CARICOM, building regional collaboration, cross-border philanthropy, bridging gaps across the Caribbean diaspora, philanthropy and the private sector, creating shared value, climate philanthropy, advancing resilience and adaptation in the Caribbean. This is where we will focus on CLASP. Shared services for regional philanthropy, strengthening the ecosystem. I think whilst the BIM is global, it demonstrates so much for the Caribbean that the BIM was hosted in Barbados. And while it's global, and that's why I was trying to get some more clarity on what it was, that, it was podiated in the Caribbean and started in Barbados, I would say, at the meeting. Shared services for regional philanthropy and the catalytic capital and blended financing that we do need right now to support, more investment strategies to improve innovation in the region, right? It will be at Strawberry Hills, and there's a lot more information at our platform, which I will put now in the chat, our link that you all could have access to. And if anybody has any questions on the forum, please feel free. Oh my God. Okay, maybe that might have been a reason why we were having internet problems. Indira is now saying they had a major fire at our national airport. Okay, is there anyone that has any questions on our Future Forward event? Or any questions with regard to the next steps very specifically under CLASP? Okay, well, if not, I'd like to bring our meeting to a close. Very much thank everyone for attending today, and we will definitely have to try to get the recording of this meeting to the group and those that may not have been able to make it, especially that such great, brilliant presentation by Sasha. So thank you all very much for attending, and I'm looking forward to meeting you all again in September, where we could finalize the CLASP draft. Oh, well, it wouldn't be a draft, the draft CLASP agreement, the actual commitment. So thank you all very much, and see you all soon online in September. Bye. Bye.
Bye.